Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get in the boat and go to the other side of the lake while he dismissed the crowds. Immediately. You kind of have to wonder why the passage starts that way. Why immediately? Did Jesus know the storm was coming and wanted them to get a good start on their boat ride to the other side? I think that makes some good sense. I also think it makes sense that Jesus was done for the day. Like, just done. It had been a long couple of days. Many of the biblical accounts make it clear that Jesus often went off by himself for rest and for prayer, for soul rejuvenation. And this seems to be one of those times, at least when he was trying to get some of that rest. Because if we back up to the beginning of this chapter, chapter 14 of Matthew, it makes even more sense. A lot really has just happened. A lot. John the Baptist had been killed, beheaded. And he was not only Jesus' cousin, he was his good friend. We know that Jesus had already heard about John's death at this point, because early in the 14th chapter it says, his disciples came and took the body of John the Baptist and buried it. Then they went and told Jesus. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. So the grief of losing John the Baptist was still very fresh. Jesus would have been grieving, and he had withdrawn to a deserted place by himself. But then in the next verses, we hear what happens, why he's not alone anymore. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. Jesus had tried to be alone, and the crowds followed him. When he went ashore, he saw the great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. So Jesus had put aside his need to be alone and to pray, and cured for the sick. Then when it was evening, the crowds were hungry. And next comes the story that's the feeding of the 5,000. So it's been a long couple days for Jesus before we get to today's passage. After all of that, the curing of the sick, the feeding of the 5,000, after all of that, he immediately made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. It says he made the disciples go. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. Can you feel the relief that he might have had at this point? Finally, some time to be alone, to gather his thoughts, to pray, to grieve, and probably to breathe a little more deeply too. This beginning part of the story is really a great reminder that Jesus did some really good self-care. He didn't just give to others and never take time to replenish his own energy and to fill his own soul. He gave to others, and he gave time to himself with God. During this time of COVID, a lot of us are having more alone time than we want or than is even mentally healthy. And a lot of us are having almost no alone time, especially parents of children who are still at home. Jesus seemed to clearly seek out time with people and time alone. And so whichever of those you're craving the most right now, you can know that Jesus has been there too. And it is important to have both. And it is part of being human to struggle when you aren't getting the time alone or the time with people that you need. take it to God in prayer as you struggle. After the evening in a deserted place, it was early the next morning that Jesus went walking toward the disciples on the sea. We don't know if Jesus sensed the danger that the disciples were in, or if he sensed that they were afraid, or why exactly he had gone to them early in the morning after having this evening alone. But he did, and they cried out in fear. And Jesus said, "Take heart, it's I, do not be afraid." They were afraid at first. They thought he was a ghost. Take heart, do not be afraid. Now, take heart is another way of saying, have courage, it will be okay. The Greek words, in fact, for take heart are used in almost all of the healing stories of Jesus. In most of the stories of Jesus healing someone, he says to them, "Take heart, your faith has made you well." Or, "Take heart, do not fear." The same word is being used in this story, as if he's approaching the disciples as in need of healing, almost. At this point, Peter says, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water." And so Jesus does. Peter gets out of the boat. He starts walking on the water toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, the storm, he became frightened and began to sink. And then he cries out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him. Immediately reached out his hand and caught him. There's that word immediately again. And it's a good thing too, because he needed to reach out his hand immediately to catch him. Now, one of the things that tends to stand out when we read this story is that Peter was walking on the water until he got scared. You just get that feeling that once he took his eyes off Jesus and looked at the wind whipping up, that's when he started to sink. Jesus often talked to the disciples like they were his children, and so it doesn't seem coincidental that when you picture Peter walking on the water, it can make you think of a little child who's taking their first steps, that teetering and tottering that they do when they get going, and then they get going too fast and finally fall. Or a child who's riding their two-wheeled bike without training wheels for the first time. In each case, the child's doing great, and then they get going faster than what feels comfortable to them. They feel like they're going to be out of control, and you can see their face start to kind of panic, and pretty soon, down they go. Unless a mom or a dad is quick enough and close enough to grab them and save them from falling. And so there seems to be a clear message that when we focus on Jesus calling us, and don't allow fear to get in the way, that we can do great and faithful and amazing things. And that's probably true, but here's the problem. Most of us, at least to some degree, we already know that. We know that we need to stay focused on Jesus and not focused on fear. It's just that it's hard to do that. We know what we need to do. Don't let fear overtake us, but we don't always know how to do that. How do you keep from feeling fearful? How do you keep from sinking? What does that even look like? How much prayer time does it take? How much contemplative time alone? How much worship and singing? How much outreach participation? How much compassion do I need to have for others? How much social justice participation? How much looking at my own prejudices and my own privileges? How much work and how much change does it take for me to live without fear and to keep from sinking? How much of all of that do I have to do? How much does it take? And even if we could figure out all we needed to do, how do we get rid of our fear? Fear is part of the human experience. Some fear is definitely not necessary. Some fear is good, and it keeps us from doing dumb things. So are we really supposed to have no fear, or just supposed to not have too much fear? I don't know if Jesus was really telling the disciples to have no fear when he said, do not be afraid, or if he was simply telling them that they didn't need to be afraid now that he was there. Don't be afraid, I'm here now, kind of thing. But now here comes what I think is the heart of the story. Peter had done the work to have a relationship with Jesus. He was trying to focus on him. He was trying to follow Jesus' command. I don't know if he had done everything he could have done. Most likely not. But he had some trust and some faith and some doubt and some fear. And when it all went together, all the work he had done, all the connecting to Jesus, all the doubt and fear, it wasn't enough for him to do it on his own. And so he's someone we can relate to, because we have fears too. And a lot of us are having more fears now than perhaps we've ever had before. We're afraid, like Peter, because the sea is so massive and we're so small, because the storm is so powerful and we are so easily sunk, because life is so beyond our control and we are so helpless in its grip. When we get scared, we start to have doubts. That's usually when the doubts come in. When we're scared, we start to have doubts about ourselves, doubts about the people we love, doubts about the goodness of people in the world, doubts about the existence of God. We can have those doubts even when we do have faith. Peter didn't have enough faith to save himself. And I think that's good news for you and me. It means it's not all up to us. It seems that what Peter did have, though, was enough faith for him to get close enough to Jesus that Jesus could catch him. Isn't that good news for us? If being saved by Jesus isn't about getting it all right, doing a number of things, but it's about trying to get close enough to Jesus so that Jesus can catch us. And by saved, I don't mean going to heaven kind of saved. I mean living now, truly living with the peace of Christ in our hearts and a song in our soul that just can't stop singing, even now, when singing isn't happening the way it used to. I mean a kind of saved that's an honest look at our weaknesses, our shadow side, and then knowing that we're loved anyway by a God who put flesh on to show us that God understands this human being thing better than we do. We can't trust in all of our abilities to get it all right. And we better not think, therefore, that we have all the right answers, ever. Peter didn't, but he did get out of the boat. He did move toward Jesus when Jesus called to him. He had some faith and some doubt, just like we do. Peter walked toward Jesus and he started to sink, just like we do. Peter had courage and he had fear, just like we do. If Peter had walked on the water just fine, he wouldn't have needed Jesus, and it would have been a different story. But he didn't. And so it's a story about us too, isn't it? No matter how much we want to trust in God, we get distracted, worried, overwhelmed by all the waves around us. And some of those waves that were already big have gotten bigger in the storms today of viruses and injustices, giving us more worry and anxiety and fear, so much that it feels too heavy and we start to sink. And it's in the middle of that Jesus reaches out his hand and grabs hold of us and saves us, catches us. This story is not about cheering us all on to get out of the boat and walk without being afraid at all. It's a story that's real life. We're going to be scared. We are going to let fear get in our way. We are going to encounter storms in our life that are devastating and all-encompassing. We are going to start out big and then feel like we're sinking. But when we do all of that, it's not the end of the story, because it's a story that's not just about us and what we're doing or not doing. It's a story about a Savior who throughout our lives is just steps away, holding out a hand amidst the worst storms, tragedies, and crisis of our lives. And he's calling, come. And even if we start to sink, his arm is there to pull us up and put us back into the boat of life. Not where storms are all gone, but a place where storms are weathered together until we can arrive safely again on the shore and see that the sun will shine again and that it will warm our hearts and our cold feet.